Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. We will be finishing up chapter 14 today as we look at the end of the conflict. I know that there's probably a lot of cheers going on out there as we think about this finishing out the year and concluding this section. So let's go ahead and get started. As we look at the wilderness campaign, we're looking at the final approximately year of the war, 1864 to 1865, as the Western Front is closing down as Grant has made his move towards Richmond, and Lee is seeking to stop the army that Grant is directing towards Richmond with one half its size. So as we look at this campaign on the Eastern Front, after Grant had been transferred to be the lead commander of all of the forces here in Virginia, we see that they face a month of some of the most costly, desperate fighting of the war. Amongst that, the Confederates take some of the early victories here in this kind of final large campaign in the summer of 1864. But one of the most notable of those was the Battle of Cold Harbor. This was June 1st through 3rd of 1864, and this event was, especially the third day of this, was nicknamed Grant's Slaughter Pen. We see that 7,000 Union troops were dead before the sun was fully up. As the men were sent into it, they said this was not war but murder. As they were ordered again and again to make charges, many of the men started refusing to charge because they saw it kind of as a death wish to do that. So in the face of these consequences, we see that in the grand scheme of this battle, Grant lost more men than Lee had in his entire army, but for Grant, he had the replacements. Lee does not. So this is going to drastically affect both of the armies. Another effect of this battle was to demonstrate the surplus that was in the North and the starvation faced in the South. So in the surplus in the North, we see the North, their supply lines are almost choked with too many supplies. They have more than enough. While on the other side, the Confederates are facing starvation. They were being issued one biscuit and one slice of bacon about every 2 days, and that was the consistency of their meals. So there wasn't a lot available to them, and it's just starting to show the weakness of the Confederacy in their ability to supply the needed items for their troops. So we'll see that this campaign up here is in the Northern Virginia, where most of this campaign, will be taking place. And so just for setting our bearings, here's Washington, D.C., here's Richmond, so all of these areas surrounding that. And then we'll look to the South and trying to finish off the South. So in Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman has been placed in charge of the troops here after Grant was promoted. And so he's kind of the head of the Western Front and is making his sweep to the South. Part of that was to take Atlanta. And so the Union forces are about 100 miles from Atlanta, very southern Tennessee, and are headed that way. So he plans to use those numbers to push through the flanks. Now, Atlanta was important to the Union cause because it was one of the last remaining railroad and manufacturing centers. All of that being relative of how many railroads or manufacturing they were able to have there, but there was a lot of warehouses down by the railroad tracks. If you've seen the movie Gone with the Wind, you can see where they filled that whole area with troops laid out along the tracks there when they were being attacked. So the Battle of Atlanta takes place in July of 1864. The Union troops after this conflict will continue to surround the city, and eventually the Confederate forces abandon it and hit the road. On September 2nd, 1864, the city of Atlanta falls to the Union. And we'll see that sweep here from Chattanooga, Tennessee, down to Atlanta, that 100 miles, and then the 300 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, as called the March to the Sea. So in that 300-mile span, Sherman will lead. He is taking a strategy to wage war on soldiers and civilians. He said, "I can make the march and make Georgia howl." So his plan was to not only attack soldiers, anybody they came in contact, but also break the will of the people by attacking the civilians. So they want to destroy supplies, any supplies that could be available to send to the Confederate forces. Sherman and his men are trying to destroy, and to show the weakness of the Confederacy, that they can't slow down their march, they can't stop them, or really face off. They're just kind of on the run. So the destruction that takes place in Georgia is a 50 to 60 mile wide damage zone for those 300 miles. So Sherman spreads out his troops and kind of says to destroy everything that's in front of them as they march to the south. So that included taking any supplies that they could find, or destroying things. If they could found horses and they could use those, they would take them. Other supplies that they couldn't easily take with them were destroyed. They would go to homes and burn and pillage what they could take there, stealing resources, gold, anything that they came across that they could use. Many of these became very scavengers, and doing awful things to the people that they encountered. They estimate this was about $100 million in damage at the time that was caused by this. Excuse me, today that would be over $1.5 billion in damage that was taken by Sherman's men as they moved to the south. Now we know in this time period, elections do not stop for war or for a worldwide pandemic, as we're about to see in November with our presidential election coming up. But the capture of Atlanta in September really helped Lincoln's chances to win his second term. He was facing a tough challenge from the Democrat, George McClellan. He had formerly been part of Lincoln's staff as one of his generals, but now he's standing in opposition to him, and running for this as Lincoln's running for re-election. But Lincoln does win by a wide margin. He received 55% of the vote. The Electoral College fell squarely in his court with 212 to 21, and he did have the support of his soldiers. 78% of the soldiers did vote to re-elect Lincoln. Many talked about the idea, running on the campaign slogan, "Don't switch horses in midstream." So they felt that Lincoln could lead the country forward in these what's going to end up being the final months of the war. Now, the final collapse does come when Grant creates this siege line along Petersburg in Virginia and makes his way towards Richmond. In the midst of this, Philip Sheridan, who's also known for the Indian Wars in the West, was destroying the Shenandoah Valley, and Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and others have to escape from Richmond, so they're not captured. And so Lee's army cannot make its way, and they come to facing out surrender. So that takes place at Appomattox. Lee will surrender to Grant on April 9th, 1865. This was Palm Sunday that year. And Grant does offer very generous surrender terms to Lee at this event. The Confederates are just to simply lay down their weapons and go home. There's not to be, he said that as celebration was occurring, the war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again. So he really wanted everyone just to kind of go back to their homes and start rebuilding from this point. Now, if you'll remember from our earlier lessons, we talked about this is the home of Wilmer McLean. He lived right outside of Manassas, Virginia, along Bull Run Creek, where the first battle of the Civil War took place after Fort Sumter. And so he had lived here, and that cannonball had gone down his chimney and blown up their lunch all over the house. And he doesn't want to be in the midst of all of this action, so he takes his family and decides to move further south into the heart of Virginia. This is his house. He just happened to move to Appomattox Courthouse, and his home was used for the surrender of Lee to Grant at this location. So his house was taken over for this grand event. When he returns, he finds his house has very little left over. Soldiers have taken pieces of wallpaper off the wall to take as souvenirs, or pieces of his chairs and his furniture, and he sees people going down the road with chairs from his dining room attached to their horses. Everyone had taken a little piece as a memorabilia of this event. So the war really started and began inside his two houses. So quite the story there. Now, when we think about the lasting impacts of these events, we see that more than 650,000 men had died, and we'll look at a chart that has kind of the breakdown of all those numbers here in just a moment. When you think about those numbers, that is more than all the U.S. wars from 1775 to 1975. So from the American Revolution to Vietnam, we lost more American men, since both sides of the conflict were Americans, than any of all those events combined. 1,000 more would be maimed for life, as you think about those who lost arms, legs, eyes, and other, were injured in a way that affected their life going forward. Also, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865. That was Good Friday that year as he went to the theater. He's assassinated, and America has lost a leader who had a plan, who had a hope to bring the country back together. We only can imagine what he could have done if he wasn't assassinated, but it's going to be left to others that will follow him to carry the burden of building the country back together again. Now, as you look here, there's some pretty staggering numbers of those that were killed in action or mortally wounded on both sides, but it's also notable to see how many died from disease. Quite the numbers here, more than doubling those that were killed in action died from diseases here, and so we do see that there was a lot of situations that caused a great strain on our country going forward. So this brings us to the conclusion of our information from the chapter. I do want to make a couple quick announcements. Please remember, all late work is due Friday, May 8th by 11:59 p.m. I will take anything that has been assigned from the start of our time here online for the last 6 weeks. Anything that you have a 0 in the gradebook for, I will accept up until that time, but after that time, it will remain a 0. Another piece of information that will be coming to you in the coming days is the final project. That is going to be due Tuesday, May 12th at 11:59 p.m. But again, it'll be open where you can complete that at any point. At the latest, I'll have that to you next Monday. I'm working on that, the final details to put that together to assign. So we will be online, and I'll ask that you check in there regularly in the next couple of weeks as we finish out our year together, just in case there's any announcements that you need to know about or questions, and if something's uploaded that I can't open and I can't get a hold of you to fix it, then we're going to have an issue. So please make sure you keep checking back on Teams even as you're turning things in for all your classes, not just mine, and make sure that you get those announcements that you need to. So I hope you all will have a wonderful day, and I will look forward to seeing you all just as soon as we can. Have a great one. Bye.